Do you believe that just one sentence can change the fate of a person? Imagine you're just a 14-year-old boy on your way to school and suddenly you're stopped by the police, handcuffed and falsely accused. No evidence, no justice, just because you look like a suspect. What would you do? Today, we're following the dramatic story of Brandon, a boy who was not only wrongfully arrested, but also had to stand up and defend himself against the legal system. What did he do to turn the case around and leave the courtroom stunned? And more importantly, this could happen to anyone, even you. Watch until the end to find out what the one sentence was that changed everything. Don't forget to leave your thoughts in the comments below. What would you do if you were in this situation? If you believe justice needs to be protected, hit the like button and subscribe now. Because stories like this aren't just entertainment. They're a wake-up call about the world we live in. Now, let's follow what happened to Brandon. The morning started like any other. Brandon Whitaker walked to school along familiar streets. The sky was gray with no hint of sunlight, but he didn't mind. His backpack weighed heavy on his shoulders, maybe because of the history test he had studied for all night, or maybe because of the upcoming debate competition. Whatever the reason, today was just another ordinary day. At least, that's what he thought. Then the alarm sounded. Brandon flinched, turning his head. Up ahead, red and blue lights flashed against the glass windows of a hardware store on the corner. A yellow police tape stretched across the entrance, officers speaking with the store owner. A robbery. Brandon slowed his pace, glancing at the scene as he walked by. But before he could leave, a sharp voice cut through the air behind him. "Hands where I can see them." Brandon froze. Before he could turn, a firm hand grabbed his arm, twisting it behind his back with enough force to send pain shooting through his shoulder. "What's going on?" he tried to ask, but his voice was drowned out by the pounding of his own heartbeat. Sergeant Gregory, a familiar name. Everyone in the neighborhood knew him, not because he protected, but because he harassed. Gregory didn't bother answering. He tightened his grip on Brandon's wrist, swiftly snapping cold steel cuffs around them. "We've got the suspect," he muttered into his radio, as if Brandon was just another statistic, not a person. But what suspect? Brandon didn't understand. He was just walking. He hadn't even been near the store. "I didn't do anything." Gregory smirked. "Don't play innocent. Security footage places you near the crime scene when the robbery happened. You match the description." "What description?" Brandon took a slow breath, trying to stay calm. He knew he was innocent. But that didn't matter, because to Gregory, only 3 things mattered. He wore a hoodie, he wore sneakers, he had black skin. A small crowd gathered. Some drivers slowed their cars to watch. A few people pulled out their phones to record, but no one stepped in. Brandon's pulse pounded as Gregory shoved him toward the patrol car. This wasn't happening, but when the car door slammed shut behind him, Brandon knew one thing for sure. His life would never be the same again. The inside of the patrol car smelled of old sweat and cracked leather. Brandon sat stiffly, wrists still locked behind his back. Every small movement made the cuffs bite deeper into his skin. He wanted to shout, to demand they check the footage, to make someone actually look at the evidence instead of pinning everything on him. But he knew better. The ride to the station was short, but it felt like forever. They yanked him from the car without a word, pushing him through the heavy doors of the precinct. His backpack was left behind. The fluorescent lights buzzed overhead, cold and sterile. They took his name first, then his fingerprints, then his shoelaces, like he was a real criminal. A tired-looking officer shoved him onto a metal chair. "Your mother has been called." His voice was flat, emotionless, as if this was just another routine booking. just another kid getting processed into the system. But Brandon wasn't just another number. He wasn't going to let them decide his fate. Time crawled, 15 minutes, 30, an hour. Then the door burst open. Emma Whitaker stormed in like a force of nature. Her eyes scanned Brandon first, checking for injuries. Then she turned to Gregory, her voice sharp as a blade. "Where is my son's lawyer? What is he being charged with?" Gregory crossed his arms, his badge catching the light. "We have security footage placing him near the crime scene." "And what's the suspect's description?" Emma asked, her tone like ice. Gregory shrugged. Hoodie, sneakers, nighttime. A fury boiled in Emma's eyes. She turned to Brandon, fists clenched. "Brandon, what were you doing this morning?" "Walking to school." Emma nodded. Then she turned back to Gregory, her gaze burning. "So, where's your evidence?" Gregory didn't answer immediately. The room felt heavier, the air thick with tension. But Brandon saw something. A flicker of hesitation in the officer's eyes. He swallowed hard, his fingers curling into his palms. They had nothing. They had no real evidence, just a grainy video and an empty accusation. But that didn't matter, because they didn't need proof to convict him. Brandon knew that, and if no one else was going to fight for him, he would fight for himself. The nightmare was just beginning. The interrogation room was cold and lifeless. The fluorescent light above flickered slightly, emitting a low, buzzing sound that only added to the suffocating atmosphere. Brandon sat stiffly on the metal chair, wrists still red from the cuffs that had just been removed. His hands clenched on his knees, trying to steady himself. He didn't know exactly what was about to happen, but he knew one thing. Everyone in this room had already decided his fate before they even asked the first question. The door creaked open. Sergeant Gregory walked in, his gaze filled with indifference and authority. He wasn't in a hurry. He was savoring his control over the situation. Behind him was a man in a wrinkled suit, holding a thick folder. Brandon recognized him immediately, the public defender his mother had requested. But he wasn't sure if this man was actually here to help him. Emma sat beside her son, hands clasped tightly together. She didn't speak, but her eyes were sharp, unwavering. "So," Gregory said, crossing his arms, "shall we begin?" He flipped open the file on the table, drumming his fingers against the hard cover. "Brandon Whitaker, 14 years old, high school student, no prior record, but—" His voice dragged, his eyes scanning Brandon like he was analyzing a specimen. "But he matches the description of a suspect in a robbery this morning." Emma gritted her teeth. "What description?" Gregory shrugged. "A hoodie, sneakers, near the scene." Brandon felt his chest tighten. That was it? That was all it took for them to see him as a criminal? His mother wasn't backing down. "What about the surveillance footage? Does it show my son breaking in?" Gregory smirked, but there was no immediate response. That was the problem. They didn't have footage of him committing the crime. Only a blurry image of someone who looked like him. The public defender finally spoke up. "They're offering a plea deal." Brandon's stomach twisted. "What?" The lawyer sighed, as if he had seen this play out thousands of times before. "If you plead guilty, you avoid trial, probation, community service, a lighter sentence." The walls of the room seemed to shrink around Brandon. He looked at his mother. Emma was shaking, but not from fear, from rage. "No." Her voice was sharp as a knife. "We're not signing anything." The lawyer exhaled heavily, like she was making things harder than they needed to be. "Ms. Whitaker, I understand you're upset, but I've seen cases like this hundreds of times. Trial isn't the route we want to take." Brandon stared at the man in front of him. This was supposed to be his defense, yet instead of fighting for him, This man just wanted him to take a false conviction so the system could close his file neatly. Best option? Brandon felt his blood boil. What about proving that I'm innocent? Gregory chuckled. Kid, the truth doesn't matter as much as closing a case quickly. Brandon's fists clenched. He felt like he was drowning in an ocean of injustice, every wave crashing down as another baseless accusation. He had to make a choice, accept the fate they had written for him, or fight for the truth. He turned to his mother. Emma didn't hesitate. She nodded at him, her eyes fierce. Number? He wasn't going to be destroyed by a system that didn't care about the truth. That night, Brandon lay in bed, staring at the ceiling. He replayed every moment in his mind. Gregory's words, the useless defense lawyer, his mother's fury. He wasn't a lawyer. He was just a kid. But even he knew this was wrong. If no one else was going to fight for him, he would fight for himself. The next morning, he made a decision. He would study the law, not to become a lawyer, but to learn how to protect himself. The school library wasn't big, but it was all he had. He flipped through every book he could find on criminal law. Burden of proof. The prosecution had to prove he was guilty, not the other way around. Chain of evidence. If law enforcement mishandled anything, it could be thrown out. Eyewitness testimony. If inconsistent, it could be discredited. The more he read, the clearer everything became. They had nothing on him, just a blurry video. And then he found the most important detail. The suspect in the footage was taller than him, much taller. If he could prove that the person in the video wasn't him, he could shatter the case against him. He didn't believe in justice anymore. He was preparing for war. Brandon was ready. He knew the system wasn't on his side. They had decided his fate the moment Gregory slapped those cuffs on his wrists. But if they thought he was going to bow down and accept a crime he didn't commit, they had completely misjudged him. The next morning, Brandon walked into the school library with a single goal in mind: learning how to defend himself. The old bookshelves, the yellowing pages, everything held the knowledge he needed to understand how the system worked and how it could be turned against itself. He found a thick book with criminal procedure embossed on the cover. He flipped it open, his eyes scanning the pages. Burden of proof. The prosecution had to prove he was guilty, not the other way around. Chain of evidence. If the police mishandled evidence, it could be thrown out. Eyewitness testimony. Witnesses weren't always reliable, especially under pressure. The more he read, the clearer everything became. They had nothing on him. No fingerprints, no stolen property, no direct witnesses. Just a blurry surveillance video. And that's when he saw it. The suspect in the video was taller than him, much taller. Brandon flipped through another section. Most security systems had height markers at the entrance. If he could prove that the person in the footage wasn't him, he could turn the whole case upside down. But he couldn't do it alone. A soft cough behind him made him jump. Aaron Langford, the school librarian, stood there, arms crossed. His sharp eyes scanned the pile of books surrounding Brandon. "What exactly are you researching?" Brandon hesitated for a moment, debating whether to lie. But then he realized he had no reason to hide. "Law?" Langford raised an eyebrow. "I'm guessing it's not because you want to be a lawyer?" Brandon sighed. "I was falsely accused. I can't just sit back and let them decide my future." Langford studied him for a long moment, then pulled up a chair. "Good. Then let's teach you how to argue like a real lawyer." An hour later, Brandon's notebook was filled with notes. Langford didn't just teach him the law. He showed him how to dismantle an argument. When can police legally detain someone? What evidence is admissible in court? And what can be thrown out? How to force the prosecution to prove every claim. Brandon swallowed hard. So, If all they have is a blurry video and a cop's testimony? Langford smirked. Then they have nothing. Brandon gripped his pen tighter. They had nothing. He wasn't afraid anymore. He was preparing for battle. Court day. The courtroom was packed. Brandon sat upright at the defendant's table, next to the public defender he had zero faith in. Across the room, Sergeant Gregory sat with his usual smirk, his confidence radiating. He thought he'd already won, but Brandon had a plan. He took a deep breath and glanced at his mother, Emma, who sat with her hands clenched in her lap, her eyes filled with hope. He wouldn't let her down. He wouldn't let this system crush him. The judge entered. The trial began. The prosecutor stepped forward, his gaze sharp. Ladies and gentlemen, this is a simple case. The defendant was apprehended near the scene. Surveillance footage places him in the area. A veteran officer identified him. We believe the evidence is overwhelming. Brandon clenched his teeth. They made it sound so easy. They made it sound like he had already been convicted before the trial even started. But they were wrong. The public defender rose, adjusted his tie, and cleared his throat. My client maintains his innocence. That was it? That was all he had to say? Number Brandon wasn't letting this slide. The judge turned to him. I understand the defendant wishes to represent himself. Brandon took a deep breath. This was his moment. He stood, feeling every eye in the courtroom lock onto him. He was no longer just a 14-year-old kid falsely accused. He was the only one who could flip this case on its head. He opened his mouth, his voice steady. Let's talk about the evidence. The courtroom fell silent. Brandon was ready. Brandon stepped forward, ready to turn the tables. No one in the courtroom expected a 14-year-old to stand up to the system, but they didn't know that Brandon had spent the entire night preparing for this moment. Taking a deep breath, he looked straight at the judge. Let's talk about the evidence. A wave of murmurs spread through the courtroom. The prosecution was just waiting for a chance to shut him down. The prosecutor, a sharp-eyed woman in a black suit, her voice as cold as steel, stepped forward. Your Honor, the evidence is clear. The security camera footage places the suspect at the scene of the crime at the exact time of the robbery. The suspect was wearing a hoodie, sneakers. Sergeant Gregory identified him. Brandon smirked. So your case is based solely on a blurry surveillance video and a police officer's word? The prosecutor clenched her jaw. He had hit their weak spot. Brandon took a step closer, his voice steady. I want to see the video. The judge nodded. The screen at the front lit up, displaying the security footage from the hardware store. The image was grainy, but a hooded figure could be seen moving through the frame. Brandon crossed his arms. Pause it right here. A court officer paused the video. Brandon tilted his head. Now, let's focus on the height marker at the entrance. The jury leaned forward, studying the screen. Brandon took a deep breath and continued. Your Honor, I am 5 feet 4 inches. So why is the suspect in the video over 5 feet 9 inches? Silence. The entire courtroom went still. The prosecutor shifted uncomfortably in her seat, but she didn't speak right away. Brandon wasn't finished. And if I'm not the suspect, then why am I here? The judge narrowed his eyes and turned to the prosecution. Does the prosecution have an explanation for this? The prosecutor swallowed. Your Honor, height can appear distorted in security footage. Camera angles are not always reliable. Brandon shook his head. Oh? Then let me ask Sergeant Gregory a question. The judge nodded. You have the right. Brandon turned to face the officer. Sergeant, when you arrested me, did you check my shoes? Gregory blinked, then tilted his chin up. Yes. And did they match the shoes of the suspect in the video? A brief silence. Gregory pressed his lips together, then muttered, Not exactly. Brandon smirked. Then why am I here? The courtroom held its breath. The jury exchanged glances. Doubt had started to creep in, but Brandon wasn't done. Let's talk about the eyewitness. The prosecutor shot up immediately. Our witness saw you running from the scene. Brandon didn't flinch. I'd like to question the witness. The judge nodded. The courtroom doors opened. A middle-aged man with a thin frame stepped onto the witness stand. He adjusted his glasses, eyes darting nervously. Brandon approached, locking eyes with him. Sir, are you certain you saw me? The man hesitated. I saw a boy in a hoodie. Brandon nodded. What color was the hoodie? Gray. Brandon narrowed his eyes. Then why is the suspect in the video wearing black? A ripple of murmurs swept through the courtroom. The prosecutor's jaw tightened. The witness looked panicked. Brandon knew he had them. Did you really see me, or did you just think it was me? The man didn't answer right away. That hesitation, that was enough. The judge sighed and tapped his gavel. Court will take a 15-minute recess. Brandon sat down, his heart pounding. But he knew one thing for sure. He wasn't just a kid falsely accused anymore. He was the one controlling the game now. The legal battle had reached its peak. Brandon sat down, feeling the weight of silence settle over the courtroom. He knew he had shaken the foundation of the case, but he also knew the prosecution wouldn't accept defeat easily. The prosecutor clutched her pen, tapping it lightly on the table as if trying to find a way to salvage the situation. But there was nothing to salvage. Everyone in the room had seen the truth. The evidence was flimsy. The eyewitness was unreliable. The suspect's height didn't match Brandon's. He had landed a heavy blow, but he wasn't done yet. The 15-minute recess passed quickly. The judge returned, tapping his gavel lightly. Let's proceed. Brandon took a deep breath, feeling every eye in the courtroom on him. He had never felt stronger. The prosecutor stood up, clearing her throat. Despite the minor inconsistencies the defendant has pointed out, the fact remains. He was found near the crime scene. He had a motive. Brandon raised an eyebrow. A motive? What motive? The prosecutor smirked, as if he had walked right into her trap. You needed money. A murmur ran through the jury. Brandon felt anger rise in his chest. Let me get this straight, he said, his voice calm but sharp. You're saying that just because I'm a black kid walking to school, wearing a hoodie, I must have had a motive to steal? The prosecutor hesitated for a split second. She knew that anything she said next could backfire, but Brandon didn't give her time to think. I'm an honors student, he continued. I'm on the debate team, preparing for a state competition. I have no criminal record, no history of theft. Brandon turned to the jury, his voice unwavering. Look at me and tell me, if I were wearing a suit instead of a hoodie, would I even be standing here today? The courtroom went silent. The judge tapped his gavel lightly. Prosecution, I remind you to base your arguments on evidence, not assumptions. The prosecutor bit her lip, flipping through her files. She was losing. Brandon felt his breath slow, his heartbeat steady. He had put them on the defensive, but he still had one more card to play. I have one last piece of evidence. Brandon turned to his public defender. The lawyer looked surprised, but the judge had already nodded. Proceed? Brandon pulled out a folded document from his pocket and stepped forward. This is Sergeant Gregory's disciplinary record. A ripple of shock spread through the courtroom. Gregory, who had been sitting silently, suddenly snapped his head up. What? Brandon gave him a cold smile. It's public record. I'm simply reading it. The judge took the paper from the court officer, adjusting his glasses as he skimmed through it. Then he looked up at Gregory. Sergeant, it appears this isn't the first time you've been accused of wrongful arrests. Gregory clenched his jaw but didn't respond. The jury whispered among themselves. The prosecutor looked pale. Brandon wasn't finished. Your Honor, I was arrested because I fit the description. But now, when we look at the facts, he's a cop with a history of false arrests. The judge nodded slowly. This is a relevant factor to consider. Gregory finally exploded. This kid is making a mockery of the system. He should have taken the plea deal. That's enough, Sergeant. The judge slammed his gavel down. Gregory instantly shut his mouth. But it was too late. He had just destroyed his own credibility. Brandon took a deep breath, sensing the shift in the room. He had fought back the only way he knew how, and he had won. The prosecutor stared at her papers, offering no rebuttal. The judge turned to the jury. I believe we have enough information. Brandon closed his eyes for a brief second. He had done everything he could. Now it was up to the jury. The moment of truth. Brandon sat up straight, feeling his heartbeat pounding in his chest. The courtroom was so silent that he could hear the anxious breaths of the people seated behind him. All eyes were on the jury. In just a few short minutes, he had dismantled the prosecution's case. The security footage didn't match his height. There was no physical evidence linking him to the theft. The eyewitness couldn't confirm with certainty that he was the person they saw. Sergeant Gregory's record proved he had a history of wrongful arrests. All of these facts pointed to one undeniable truth. They had nothing on him. But what would the jury decide? Brandon swallowed hard and glanced at his mother. Emma clasped her hands tightly. Her eyes filled with worry, but also with hope. His future rested in the hands of strangers sitting in the jury box. Would they see the truth, or would they let prejudice cloud their judgment? The judge tapped his gavel lightly. Jury, have you reached a verdict? The foreman, a middle-aged man with graying hair, slowly stood up, holding a sheet of paper in his hands. He took a deep breath before speaking. We have, Your Honor. Time seemed to slow. Brandon clenched his hands into fists, bracing himself for the worst. The foreman cleared his throat, locking eyes with the judge. On the charge of theft. A pause. Brandon held his breath. We find the defendant not guilty. The courtroom erupted. Emma let out a shaky breath, tears spilling from her eyes as she pulled her son into a tight embrace. Brandon didn't react at first. He had prepared himself for an unjust verdict, for a longer fight. But now it was over. He had won. The judge nodded, his voice solemn. The defendant is free to go. This case is dismissed. He brought the gavel down, sealing the final word. The prosecutor bit her lip, clearly displeased, but there was nothing she could do. Gregory stiffly rose from his seat, his face flushed with anger. He had believed he could crush a kid's future with a single accusation, as he had likely done to many others before. But today, he lost, and that infuriated him. Gregory stepped forward, about to say something, but the judge shot him a firm look. Sergeant, I will be requesting an internal investigation into your conduct in this case. The words struck like a second blow. Gregory's jaw tightened, but he didn't argue. He turned sharply and stormed out of the courtroom. Outside the courthouse, the sunlight felt warmer. Brandon took a deep breath, the air feeling lighter than when he first walked in. Emma stood beside him, her hand still resting on his shoulder. You did it, she whispered, her voice thick with emotion. I'm so proud of you. Brandon gave her a small smile, but it didn't feel like an ending. He looked around and saw familiar faces, a few classmates, people who had followed his story from a distance. Aaron Langford stood nearby, his eyes filled with quiet pride. You proved the truth, he said. Brandon wasn't sure if this was truly a victory, because he should never have had to prove his innocence in the first place. That was supposed to be the system's job. But it wasn't, and he knew he wasn't the only one. How many others had been caught in the same web of injustice, without the chance to fight back? How many had pleaded guilty simply because they didn't know how to defend themselves? He couldn't just walk away and forget. Brandon turned to Langford. I want to learn more about the law, not just to protect myself, but to help people like me. Langford smiled, his expression filled with approval. Then you better get started. Brandon nodded. He knew this wasn't the end of his story. Today he had saved himself. Tomorrow he might save someone else. Brandon stepped out of the courtroom, feeling the warmth of the sun against his skin. The air outside felt lighter, freer than the oppressive coldness of the courthouse. He had walked in as a defendant, but now he was leaving as a free man. Beside him, his mother, Emma, held his hand tightly. She had fought for him without hesitation, without fear. When the court declared him not guilty, he saw the tears streaming down her face, not from sadness, but from relief, from knowing that justice had finally been served. But he also knew that not everyone got this chance. Behind them, a crowd of reporters had already gathered. Cameras flashed, microphones were thrust forward, voices overlapping. Brandon, how do you feel after proving your innocence? Do you have anything to say about the justice system? What are your plans now? Brandon looked directly into the cameras, for the first time in days without fear. He knew exactly what he needed to say. I should never have had to prove my innocence in the first place. The press area fell silent. This system is supposed to protect people, but instead, it puts the burden on the innocent. He continued, his voice unwavering. I was lucky enough to defend myself, but how many others don't get that chance? How many have been forced to plead guilty because no one stood up for them? He turned to glance back at the courthouse, the place that had detained him, judged him, and nearly destroyed his future. I won't stay silent. The crowd stood still, absorbing his words. Nearby, Langford stood with his arms crossed, nodding slightly. He knew Brandon wasn't just a boy who had won a trial. He was someone who was going to change the way things worked. Months later, Brandon was no longer the boy who had trembled in fear when handcuffed. He had started a journey he never expected to take. At school, he founded a small club for students who wanted to learn about the law. Not everyone cared, but those who needed it understood its importance. He spent hours in the library with Langford, researching the system, understanding how everything worked. He didn't just read books, he read real cases, real stories of people who had been in his position. One day, while studying in the library, a nervous freshman approached him. Brandon? Brandon looked up to see a younger boy, his eyes filled with uncertainty. I heard you know about the law. I think I need help. Brandon glanced at the open book in front of him. At that moment, he realized he had truly made a difference. He hadn't just saved himself, he was becoming someone who could help others. Brandon smiled and pulled out a chair. Sit down, tell me what's going on. The system won't change easily, but people like Brandon won't stop fighting. Today, he won his battle. Tomorrow, he'll help someone else win theirs. Lessons from Brandon's story. Brandon's story isn't just about justice, it's about the power of knowledge and perseverance. He was thrown into an unfair system where assumptions and biases could have destroyed his life. But instead of accepting his fate, he learned the law and used it as his weapon to fight back. His story is a reminder that truth doesn't reveal itself. It must be proven, fought for. Not everyone gets the chance Brandon had, but with knowledge and courage, we can change the reality of injustice. Justice isn't just an idea, it's a responsibility, and each of us has a role in protecting it. Thank you for watching. If you found this video interesting or enjoyable, please show your support by giving it a thumbs up. It really helps the channel grow and reach more amazing viewers like you. Don't forget to hit that subscribe button and turn on the notification bell so you never miss out on our future uploads. Your support means the world to us and keeps us motivated to create even better content for you.